Hello, and welcome to this now as we look at the material for our reflection for the third Sunday of the year. And once again, we return to our guide, who is this year Matthew, our guide evangelist. We have had interruptions. Let me begin, first of all, by giving what the readings are so we can move on. The first reading, again, comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 8, verses 23, and then through chapter 9, verses 3. The second reading continues the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, and then verse 17. We will have occasion to look a little more in detail at the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, but for now we're just getting introduction sections for our Sunday weekend readings. The Gospel comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 12 through 23. So let's begin there by pointing out that Matthew's Gospel is comprised, first of all, with two introductory chapters, namely 1 and 2, which we call the infancy accounts. And we have looked at those over the last couple of months, pointing out that the story of the visit of the Magi, which occurs in chapter 2, is followed by a series of connections, which finally brings Jesus and Joseph and Mary to Nazareth, where Jesus will grow up. So the infancy narratives end with Jesus in the Galilee. This is followed in chapter 3 by episodes that have to do with John the Baptist. Now, we've already looked earlier on in the year to the stories connected with the Baptist, and there is also connected in this section the story of Jesus being not only baptized in the Jordan, but also going into the wilderness. That section of Matthew's story we will look at later in the year when the season of Lent begins, and the first Sunday of Lent will bring that particular episode from Matthew's story into our account. So, where are we now? As we enter chapter 4 is in a certain way an introduction to the great, what's called the Sermon on the Mount, or the great message that is core to Matthew's story. In the meantime, as chapter 4 begins, what we will not be hearing is the material that's found in chapter 1, in verse 1 rather, leading up to chapter 12, verse 12. So what we'll look at just very briefly is what is missing here, 1 through 11, what is being told there. What is being told there is that Jesus continues his mission. He is now pictured as being in the Galilee, which is the territory in which he has grown up. Now, a little bit of background, some of this, and it's important perhaps to notice at this point that the material that Matthew uses in this chapter, chapter 4, basically can also be found in Mark. So not a lot of differences of material or emphasis is found here. Matthew makes a few corrections which he feels would be important to kind of appreciate the gospel story. Now, as verse 12 begins, it points out that Jesus begins his ministry after John the Baptist has been arrested. So it's interesting that there's a consistency here among the synoptics that Jesus' mission begins when John's end. That isn't exactly the same in the fourth gospel, as a little different variation here. And It's John's arrest that leads Jesus to withdraw to the Galilee. It's not a retreat or a flight from danger, but faced with the hostility and the threat from the ruling authorities, Jesus at this point does not confront them on their own terms, and therefore moves into a place where there is a greater chance of not open conflict yet with the authorities. So therefore, that's why the Galilee becomes an important place. Jesus begins his mission, as we hear, not in the remote village of Nazareth, but in the more recognizable place known as Capernaum or Capernaum. Now, we've mentioned this before, but just to kind of review quickly a little bit the background here. This was a sizable city by the Sea of Galilee. It was territorially associated with the northernmost tribes of Israel, namely Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, I mention this because in the first reading, reference is made to that fact. The Sea of Galilee, or sometimes known as the Galilee of the Gentiles, is just this, that it had a mixed population in Jesus' time. There were many, of course, who were Jewish and therefore of the same background and tradition of Jesus. But it had also, for various reasons, mainly because of its location for trade purposes, had a variety of those of different cultures and different backgrounds who also settled there. Naphtali and Zebulun, by the way, were the first two tribes of the 12. Remember that Jacob had 12 sons, and they were known as the 12 tribes, had been the first two who, at the time of the invasion by the Assyrians, had been led into exile. So in a certain way, they had a history of suffering. And so it would make some sense in the way in which Matthew frames his story that they would also be the first to kind of be restored or brought into the new message. Now, Nazareth, as we mentioned, was a small village, probably volume-wise in terms of number of people from 100 to 200. Although it was, and we've mentioned this before, located about 4 miles from Sepphoris, which Herod Antipas had decided to rebuild as a Greek city. And therefore, obviously, the workers who came there, some of them would be Hebrew, but others would be outsiders. What I'm trying to kind of suggest here is that this mixed congregation would be part of the overall message that Matthew would include, that not only was the message of Jesus, although specifically, as we have mentioned many times, it does seem that the gospel writer Matthew is gearing his message fundamentally to a fellow group of Hebrews or Jews who have accepted Jesus, and this is part of the conflict, and we will notice this rather a number of times throughout the year as we look at Matthew's story. Now, Capernaum is located on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Again, a little reference to the Sea of Galilee. We have mentioned this before. And a little bit of geography is important here, and that's what's being developed in these little sections that we're hearing this time, in order to appreciate that Jesus came into a world that was very real. It was not an imaginary world, but it was a world made up of people, their concerns, their interests, and their difficulties. The Sea of Galilee is shaped like a harp, and is the only fresh body water in Israel. That made it very important. At its widest point, the Sea of Galilee is 8 miles. It is 32 miles if you went all the way around it to kind of circumference it that way. Capernaum, located in the northeastern side of the sea, was an important town. Well, more than an important town, it was really a trade center because it was part of what was known as the Via Mare, or the Way of the Sea. And this road followed the western part of the sea, which therefore took it down, coming from the Middle East, coming this way, if you want, from the east, and then moving its way south down toward Egypt. By the way, the Sea of Galilee has various different names. We have mentioned this before, sometimes known as the Sea of Gennesareth, Chinnereth, if you're spelling it, known as the Sea of Tiberias, because there was the city of Tiberias built on one of the shores of this lake or sea. A term not often used because of its connection with the Romans. Tiberias is obviously named after the emperor. Or it is also known as the Lake of Gennesareth, which would be its Hebrew name. All right, so all of that is a little bit of background with regard to the city. Capernaum, as we mentioned, is important as a trade city. Keep in mind that in the Galilee, there were really two industries now. We're going to examine this a little bit as we go along here today. There were really two industries that people lived by, farming and fishing. So the land here in Galilee was generally good for agriculture, and that was one of the advantages of living there. Remember that we said that this whole territory is below sea level, therefore the weather tends to be warmer regularly, not all that warm sometimes, but nevertheless is much warmer than other parts of Israel. That was to its advantage. Galilee, which really is, as a territory, makes up really 45 miles north to south. So if you kind of were looking at your geography class, that would be its distance. Bounded on the east by the rivers Jordan and by the Sea of Galilee. On the north, it is bound by Samaria. On the south, rather, it's bound by Samaria, and on the north and west by what was known as Syrophoenicia. So it's kind of boxed in if one looks at the geography here. Samaria separates, as you remember, the Galilee from Judea, but is technically really a part of Israel. And there was always, by the way, a certain tension between the Galileans and the Judeans in the south. The southerners, the Judeans, often thought of the Galileans as sort of the hick towns, kind of the, mainly because of this reference that it was the Galilee of the Gentiles, therefore kind of thought them as not as pure blood. And clearly the temple, which was in the south, in Judea, was where the action of worship in terms of honoring God was taking place. And it was there that the Galileans had to, on occasion, 3 times a year, if that was at all possible, journey to Jerusalem for celebrating the 3 great events of Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. All right. So all of that is a little bit of background. And even Galilee was divided into what was known as Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. So there was a lot of, if you want, kind of important geographic understandings of place that went on in the time that we're looking at, in the time of Jesus. Now, the full story, by the way, and as verse 12 begins of what we're looking at, Jesus begins his ministry after the Baptist is arrested, okay? So he's off the scene. Now, the full story, the imprisonment of John and his death, is told in Matthew's Gospel later on in chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. And it will be told there by way of a flashback, kind of explaining how it was that John got to be in prison. Important to notice here is that the fate of the Baptist foreshadows the fate of Jesus. So always keep in mind that what the Baptist had done, how he had challenged the authorities of his time, and Jesus would follow a similar pattern, would often result in not such favorable terms. So the message comes now that Jesus will be teaching that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, here again, a little aside, there is a discussion about the term kingdom of heaven. Some would point out that Matthew, being very attentive to Hebrew understandings, does not call his message the kingdom of God because he doesn't like to use the word God, and rather than does that substitute for that to call it the kingdom of heaven. Now that is true, that often as Jesus is pictured as teaching, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, is true to a certain extent, because if one reads in other places in Matthew's gospel, he does refer to it as the kingdom of God. So to say that exclusively in the Matthean tradition, he uses heaven with that understanding is also not correct. So the more you kind of look at these things, the more complicated it becomes. Perhaps what Matthew has in mind is that the kingdom of heaven has to do with the things in the realm of the divine, in the realm of God, and that the kingdom of heaven is unlike what the kingdoms of this world would be like. So it will be different. So the kingdom of heaven has perhaps a unique understanding as the Matthean tradition develops it. And important and beautiful to see that this is what he has in mind. By the way, some who, this again is a little aside, who translate kingdom say it, well, when you use the word kingdom, the power of kings, is that maybe what the gospel writers have in mind and what Jesus has in mind, and suggest that a different translation might be important here. Rather than to call it the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, call it the kin of heaven or the kin of God, namely the children, the family. That translation is not really caught on, but it is one of the more recent interpreters of this gospel suggests that that would put more into proper perspective what exactly the message of Jesus is. So again, there's a little bit of an aside. Now, as this material that we're looking at this point pictures Jesus as beginning his mission by choosing followers or disciples. And as we will hear, he will name 4 members, namely Peter and Andrew, James and John. Now, how does this unfold? Well, it pictures Jesus as going out and noticing these fishermen. Now, let's keep in mind, first of all, that all 4 of the men who Jesus calls are fishermen. They are not poor men, okay? As I mentioned, this is one of the major occupations of people who live in the Galilee, particularly on the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Gennesareth, that therefore they're probably fairly well off, that they are making a pretty good salary. They are experienced men, by the way. These are not men who don't know what they're doing. Obviously, if they're cleaning their nets, getting them ready, there's a harvesting of fish from the sea. Now, we don't always think of that. When we use the word harvest, we tend to think of crops like wheat and grain and things like that. But also keep in mind that there are certain times of the year when the availability of fish, who kind of, we use the term that there are schools of fish now. I'm not sure that they're learning too much, but that they kind of gather together. There are certain times when there are more fish in this regard than in others, and that's the time in which the fishermen go out and bring in the fish. So hence the term harvesting the fish, and bring them into their boats, do the process of separating the large from the small, etc., etc. So these men are experienced. See, sometimes we say, well, they never went to school, they never, did they read and write? Chances are that they might even have been able to do that, to read and write, in order to keep records of what they had caught, how they were trading it, where they were using it. I think it's important to notice that these four men, two sets of brothers, by the way, were probably not the poorest of the poor, nor the uneducated in terms of how life worked and the things that needed to be done. So it begins by Jesus calling Peter and Andrew and inviting them to come follow him. And the reference being made, I will make you fishers of people. So there's a kind of clever little change here. If they're talented in catching the fish out of the water of the sea, they will now be invited to become catchers of men into a new message, into a new way, okay? Now, symbolically, there is the importance that they will probably have to leave their way of doing things in order to follow in this new path. They would probably have to leave some of their family ties and the security, really, of their old livelihood. So there is, in this call of these four men to be followers of Jesus, a discontinuance of the way in which they were doing things. And there, of course, is the challenge. Now, we've mentioned that it's the call of Peter and Andrew, goes along a little bit further along the shore, and one would probably suggest that James and John, who are the sons of Zebedee, were also in some partnership with Peter and Andrew. To think that they all just worked separately would probably not be the case. Now, James and John also leave immediately and follow Jesus. That raises an interesting question. What is it about the four of them that they are so willing to quickly leave and engage in fellowship with Jesus? Some would argue that it's the attractiveness and persuasiveness of Jesus. If that's true, what is it that he said to them except follow me? Had they noticed that Jesus was doing some work in Capernaum already, that he had been teaching in the synagogue? We have mentioned earlier on, by the way, that synagogue here, the word itself means a gathering place. Usually this took place when males could meet on a regular basis to either study or pray. So if they had noticed Jesus doing this, and even been part of this, they had some sense of what his teaching was about, what he saw as his mission to be. So you gathered in the synagogue, not necessarily on a day of worship, but simply on a day of rest. Now this again is an interesting development, that the idea of the gathering in the synagogue for the sake of worship is really a contribution that Christianity begins to bring into this understanding of synagogue. So again, as I'm mentioning in our talks today, there are a number of different understandings that in terms of geography and place and of doing things that might be important to notice. By the way, James here, who is one of the sons of Zebedee, needs to be distinguished from the fact that there are other James mentioned. There is a second James in the 12 apostleship. He is called the son of Alphaeus. We don't know too much about him. And there's also another James mentioned in the New Testament who is called the brother of Jesus. So this James is not those two. He is therefore the brother of John, okay? And they had their father, who is Zebedee. It's the one case where a father is noted. Therefore, again, fishing was a family business, a family trade, and that is important. So they follow Jesus, leaving behind. Now, we're not quite sure, and I may have mentioned this before, if indeed there's a certain time of the year in which you harvest crops on the land, and that there's a certain time of the year in which you harvest crops out of the sea, and that's why they were cleaning their nets, because this job was done. Could it be that they were simply leaving forever the trade of fishing, or were they following Jesus as he would move around in the Galilee? And that's why I mentioned earlier that the actual territory of leaving behind their families, we assume that they were living in Capernaum or in that Bethsaida, which wasn't too far away from Capernaum. Therefore, that it isn't saying that they never returned to their family, but nevertheless that their devotion now and dedication would be to Jesus. So, and what is also interesting is Jesus chooses. He goes out of his way to choose these 4 disciples. Usually, the way in which this worked is that disciples came to an important teacher. He didn't go to them, they came to him. So the very fact that Jesus' whole idea of the mission of the kingdom and how he would carry it out is different in terms of his style. Remember, with regard to the Baptist, people had come to the Baptist. He hadn't gone to them. So here you have a reversal of the way in which the mission of God's kingdom is taking place. With that in mind, keep in mind the first reading, again, which comes from Isaiah, talks about heathen Naphtali and Zebulun. I've mentioned them before. There was also a little play on the idea of darkness, and that the light will come now into the darkness. Keep in mind that in Matthew's point of view, there were 2 great darknesses: the Babylonian exile, which had taken place earlier, and Roman occupation, which was darkness. It brought with it deprivation of freedom, imperial taxes, unjust and injustice and inequality. And so all of this is darkness. The message that Jesus and his disciples will bring into the darknesses of everyday life is a new light, a new way of living, a new way of looking at things. So all of this is a bit of background this time to the material that will lead next time, as we'll see, to the beginning of Jesus' great sermon. In the meantime, we notice the humanness of Jesus, the everydayness of Jesus, and of the disciples whom he chooses. Good to be with you. Hope to see you again.